Today I'm going to be talking about aerobic threshold, or AET, and that's the point where the blood lactate level begins to curve just before we go up to anaerobic threshold, around 2 millimoles of blood lactate, where our breathing first begins to really change from easy to laboured. And for me as a coach, it's been a really important reference point for developing athletes, and one that I've used even with short course athletes over the years to determine their capacity to hold high speed for low oxygen cost. And that's important even in relatively short races, which of course is a benefit right across the board. So if I had to pin one particular point where I've found the most purchase as a coach, and in terms of developing athletes and broad spectrum athletes as well, age groupers, juniors, all sorts, this is it. Aerobic threshold is it. So in my experience over the years, I've seen a lot of athletes who've trained at polar opposites ends of the spectrum, right? Like high intensity, low intensity, very little in between, right? And this is problematic because aerobic speed is built by concentrating on that turning point. Now, it's not the easiest thing to go and get a blood lactate test, but it's roughly your aerobic threshold. If your threshold is, let's say your threshold is 175 beats a minute, you can make a safe bet that if you're reasonably well trained, that at 147 to 153 beats a minute, that'll be the zone that you need to work in. It's well, I don't know, 22 beats a minute under your anaerobic threshold. Or to use an RPE yardstick, it's the last point where we can breathe only through our nose or hold a conversation. And when I first get people to follow this aerobic threshold focus, I often find it slow or choppy, which is a warning sign in itself, right? If you're 20 beats under anaerobic threshold and you're slow, you need to work with it. And I've seen a lot of athletes develop this particular point to a point where they're really starting to move. And trust me, when you start moving well at this point, then your anaerobic threshold capacity is impacted by your ability to hold steady when you're going hard in the red zone. Why? Because there's more oxygen in it. And I've seen the proof in the pudding. When people's aerobic threshold is well trained, it takes very little anaerobic threshold training to get the speed really tanking. And it's resilient, and the back end's there. And I've personally witnessed some of our pro athletes moving at ridiculously high speeds in this aerobic threshold zone, right? And, when they did that, I knew their capacity to race was on point. The thing is that it has this effect across the board, regardless of your athletic level. And when you develop it and you see it dropping over time, let's say for a 5K, your speed keeps dropping, it adds a real confidence. It adds a real confidence to your step. So in practice, right, it could look like this. Let's use swimming as the first example. With swimming, I prefer to use pace because it's just easier. Let's say your threshold speed is, 5 minutes 30 for a 400 meter rep. And you practice to find the point where you're at the edge, where your breathing is keeping up with your pace. And then you work to relax and build speed from that point. So if your threshold is 5:30, for instance, you might swim the rep at 5:45 and your breathing might be able to keep up. And from there, you work the zone, right, to keep the breathing at the same pace as the swim speed is. And that's very trainable. So you end up at this point where your speed is getting better and your aerobic cost is actually staying the same or getting less. And this is what we talk about when we talk about aerobic speed. You're developing your capacity to swim faster for lower oxygen cost. And in terms of biking, I always found longer reps were more beneficial when working on aerobic threshold. So similarly to running, if your threshold on the bike is, say, 7 beats lower, 166 beats a minute, you'd be shooting for somewhere around 147 BPM, or about 76% of your FTP. But again, you want to play with it to see where you feel the point across. You got to pay attention inwards as well. Working on this point will bring you speed, again, for a lower oxygen cost. And of course, bike strength plays an important role here, but even here, doing strength reps at aerobic threshold pays big dividends because you're working on that zone. So in terms of moving from biking to running, finding the aerobic threshold sweet spot and working it will do more for your run speed and your back end than any other thing you can do. Forget speed sessions. I mean, I'm talking the resilience that you get from this focus is stronger than just about any other thing that you could invest in or do. It's so underrated. The feeling of good aerobic speed fills you with confidence that, yes, I can operate at a high level of effort for a low aerobic cost. And I'm not feeling like I'm breathing through a straw, right? I'm not feeling like I'm suffocating here. I'm in control. So in running terms, you might pin out your runs where you've got checkpoints, right? And you're consistently running your times, and you're doing checkpoints to work at the same heart rate and find out how much faster you got there than in previous times. Or you can use a Mark Allen 5-kilometer test sort of thing, where you're doing a 5K time trial every month to see how your aerobic threshold is improving at that rate, you know. But in my opinion, you're better working at it consistently as one of the linchpins of your program. So, you know, and from there, of course, you're mixing up all kinds of intensities and aerobic speed and your strength focuses but this aerobic threshold focus is bringing more oxygen carrying capacity into everything. And, you know, in a racing sense, it gives you this ability to find your red zones much, much easier, because when you hit the red zone, you're not punted from the red zone. You're not pushed back by, let's say, 10%. You're pushed back 1%, where your breathing comes under control again, because you're so aerobically well conditioned, so aerobically well trained. And this aerobic focus that we've talked about in the past has put a lot of people off because they think of it as going slow. Now, I mean, what I'm talking about here is working the aerobic threshold zone to the point where you can function at quite high rates for relatively low oxygen costs. Now, just imagine that you're running currently 5K at your aerobic threshold of, let's say, 173 BPM, 175 BPM at 23 minutes. And then over the course of, say, 3 months, that's dropping down, right? 23 minutes, I don't know, 2150, you know, 2120, you know, 20 minutes, 1950, and it keeps dropping like that. You can essentially feel that across the board in your training. You've got direct feedback that's telling you that your aerobic conditioning is starting to really build. It's really starting to punt now. And once you get that, you're building in a confidence that you can't get any other way. Now, you might think you can go to the track and you can slam yourself and you'll get this resilience, but it won't happen, because the aerobic threshold, the AT2 component, the AET, is the zone that holds everything up. Get into it. Thanks for listening.